Hey folks, Layman Pascal here, and this is probably the first in a new integral stage series focusing on international affairs and trying to enter dialogues that reach beyond the exaggerated Anglo-American insularity that might plausibly be a limitation on our integrative understanding and outreach. The goal here is not to provide the news or even to perform a simulation of deep geopolitical understanding. In fact, if you're anything like me, you probably have a healthy suspicion of so-called geopolitical experts and a robust critical indifference to what mainstream and mainstream alternative media wants to circulate as its stressful, polarizing, narratively captured, institutionally and corporately distorted so-called news. So where does that leave us? Well, the main thing we could do here is to speak to and speak with the rich personal experience of people who are integrally informed, meta-modern liminal type folks with connections to parts of the world that we're interested in. So our first discussion today is going to be about the teardrop of India, Sri Lanka, a large island region off the southeast tip of the Indian subcontinent that was formerly and rather beautifully called Ceylon. To explore the multidimensional political and pragmatic lived experience of this part of the world, I'm joined by someone I consider a legit female elder in our tribe, transformative counselor, developmental facilitator, Naropa graduate, deep integral insider, and also nobody in this world, Namali Pereira. Hi, Namali.
Hi. Wow, that was amazing. And so many times I wanted to take a breath for you on your behalf.
Thank you. I'll do one. Yeah.
Yes. Well, thank you. Thanks for having me. And actually, the first thing that I would say to you is I'm actually touched by any North American, especially, inquiring into the issue of Sri Lanka, because I remember when I first moved to Boulder and joined this sort of the integral world, a couple years later, in 2004, was the Sri Lankan or the Asian Tsunami, which started in Indonesia. And it hit Sri Lanka as the second most damaged region. 46,000 people died in Sri Lanka as a result of that tsunami. And I remember no one asking me about it. I was the only Sri Lankan that a lot of Americans that I had come into contact with here knew. And I remember just feeling pretty, and I'm very much in the integral community as well, how surprised I felt when no one really asked me. Like, wow, 46,000 people from your country just died, and like within a matter of a day, and how are you doing, or what's going on for you? Do you know people who've been impacted by this tsunami? And as time's gone by, I've just seen in much of America, there's very little international interest, and that I can include the integral community itself to some degree, or this sort of, in general, this liminal space. So I'm touched. I appreciate that you're asking me. You invited me to talk a little bit about Sri Lanka, and so thank you.
Oh, good. That makes me feel like I'm doing something worthwhile.
You are, at least to me, at least to one person. So yeah.
That's where it starts. It starts with one. I do want to get to your personal impressions of the current geopolitical situation and the state of emergency, but I don't want to start there. I'd like to sort of anchor it in some more general experience of what it is to be in Sri Lanka. So I thought of this weird question, which was, so I'm in Canada and it's full of people who are officially Canadian. But once in a while, I meet somebody who really exemplifies like old-fashioned Canadiana as a stereotype, or maybe even embodies the idiosyncratic folk spirit of the geology and the culture. And so I wanted to ask you, as sort of like an absurd icebreaker, who's the most Sri Lankan person you know?
Wow, who's the most Sri Lankan person I know? Can I include myself in that?
Include yourself in that.
In all honesty, like sort of if I take a developmental look, I think Sri Lanka straddles that pre-modern to modern kind of region. And when I think about a lot of just very generally speaking, when I think about a lot of the general population of Sri Lanka, a lot of the lower to middle income folks really really exemplify that in many ways. And so I mean, if I'm trying to think of who is actually not Sri Lankan, but can look like Sri Lankan, I see a lot of them, and I hear that language and that grammar sometimes from some of the Republicans in this country.
Interesting.
Like I watch, or like some of the traditional media. So I can't say a person, like I can't kind of put a name to that, but developmentally speaking, the general similarities are incredible. Like traditionalism in the US can actually, like the religious pride that they might have, the nationalism, wanting to really appreciate roots and language and things like that. It's identical to a lot of Sri Lankan, and what I would say is the typical Sri Lankan.
I think of American Republicans, well, maybe not quite the like Trump populist version necessarily, but sort of the classic Republican as being traditionalist in their feelings, but attempting to be modernist in their cognition and their understanding of the world, and sort of straddling that move.
Yeah.
So it sounds like that archetype is strong in Sri Lanka, as I imagine it is in a lot of the countries around the world at the moment.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's where some of us who have this developmental view, and some of the maps, crude as they sometimes may be, it's still a very useful heuristic just to look at these kinds of situations and scenarios through, because it just makes sense. The struggles are the same, the gifts are the same. I mean, there are definitely some cultural differences. Like I think the sort of the pre-modern or traditionalists in Sri Lankans may not at all understand the American traditional argument for guns or something like that. Might be hard for them to understand. So, and I guess in general, North Americans have a little bit more of an individualistic nature. You definitely will see if you go to Sri Lanka there, you really do feel the collectivist flavor of culture in general. So certainly the contrasts are there, but developmentally, boy, the similarities are amazing.
What is so from the Canadian point of view, we are very similar to Americans with a few differences, and very often our identity is based on those little differences. Sri Lanka must be so similar to India in many respects, but also have a few of those slight differences of its own. What's your sense of the cultural relationship to India? Like what's the Sri Lankan food? Is this a curry and pakora area, or?
Yeah, love it. Love it. That's very good. It's actually surprisingly different. So I think we look alike, but we don't speak the same language. India speaks 300 something odd languages. Sri Lanka really just speaks primarily just 2 or 3 languages. My native language, I'm not a native English speaker. My native language is called Sinhalese. So the biggest difference is that India is primarily Hindu and Muslim, which has that sort of theistic, like the God language is really common in India. And in Sri Lanka, you don't hear that much. And that Sri Lanka is primarily Buddhist, Theravadan Buddhist. And it's old school Buddhism. So there's a very, like, I never grew up with the word God in around me. So that word just completely flies over my head. In Sri Lanka, in general, because the sort of the God language hasn't dominated culture historically, I noticed there's a little bit more sort of ease and freedom in people. Like Sri Lankans like to finish work and they'll head to the beach and get drunk and like eat chicken and like big meat eaters. We're not like India is primarily vegetarian. Sri Lanka is a little bit more westernized in some ways. It's a smaller nation, obviously, it's a much smaller country in size and in population, So being colonized for a long time by the Portuguese, then the Dutch, then the British, for hundreds of years, we have those influences in Sri Lankan culture more than you would notice that in India. The food isn't the same either. You're in BC, right? Are you in Vancouver?
No, I grew up on the West Coast, but I've moved to Ontario in the last couple of years.
Okay. Yeah. I spent a day in Vancouver and I was determined to find a Sri Lankan restaurant and I found it and the food sucked, unfortunately. But so I would not recommend that Sri Lankan restaurant. But Sri Lankan food is, I don't know how really to describe it, but it's not like Indian food. There is rice. We have less rotis in Sri Lankan food. We have other alternative kinds of food. We have food that has some Portuguese influence that Sri Lankans don't even realize that that's actually more Portuguese than Sri Lankan. In our language, my last name, for example, Pereira, is actually Portuguese. So Sri Lankans, because of our Portuguese colonization, some of the most common last names of Sri Lanka are names like Pereira, De Silva, Fernando, Pinto, De Soisa. These are some of the most common last names, and they're all Portuguese last names. So yeah, I'll just leave it at that. Those are some of those common differences.
That's really nice. I like getting some of the flavor. Could you say something in Sinhalese?
Sure. So repeat after me. Mage nama.
Mage mana?
Mage nama.
Mage nama.
Layman.
Layman. Is that my name?
Mage nama. Yes. Yeah. So there we go. So
Very
I can
nice.
say a little bit more. Like I'll say.
Please, let's. I mean, I'd love for people to hear some of the tones.
Yeah. I'll say. Layman ekka mama ada kata karanne mata bohoma satutuයි ඒ ගැන. Api kata karanne Sri Lankaව ගැන.
I'll just nod knowingly.
Yeah. So what I just said was I'm speaking with Layman today, and I'm very happy to be joining you here. And what we're talking about today is Sri Lanka.
Yeah. Okay, so your country is in a state of emergency.
Well,
as I understand it, President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, whose families sort of run the country for their own benefit for years, has fled. And a fairly unpopular acting president, Ranil Wickremesinghe, declared the state of emergency and is desperately trying to get loans from predatory international financing groups. Maybe you could walk us through your awareness of these events as they've unfolded. What did you hear and see? How has this been registering on your consciousness?
Yes, absolutely. So let me give you a little bit of history to that. So like I already mentioned just a little while ago, Sri Lanka has a complex history, culturally speaking. You know, our earliest history is around sort of 500 BC when people from India came to this little island. And, you know, Buddhism was introduced around 260 BC. It's in the cultural threads. And we have cultural events that date back to, 160 BC and such. So there's a lot of rich history and heritage in that sense. Around the 1500s, at the same time the Portuguese went to Brazil, they also came to Sri Lanka. So several hundred years of Portuguese, Dutch, and British colonization from 1550 to 1948. Just feel into what it's like for a culture to be colonized by three Western mega nations. So that obviously when in 1948, when finally the British left, the Sinhalese people, which is my kind, the majority people, suddenly felt like, yeah, we have our country back after hundreds of years. What that created was a sense of nationalism. They made Sinhalese, my language, the official language of the country, which meant that the Tamil Hindu minority of the country were going to start to get discriminated against. They couldn't apply for certain jobs. And so little by little, there was racism and economic discrimination primarily against the Hindu minorities. That gave rise to a very brutal civil war in 1983, which went on until President Rajapaksa, Mahinda Rajapaksa, one of the brothers that you just mentioned, he became the president in 2008, promising that he will end the 26-year-old war, the civil war, which by then had taken more than 100,000 lives. 100,000 lives. It's by the end of the war, it was, I think, around 125 to 150,000 lives lost. And that's roughly about 5,500 lives lost every year, which is roughly about 2 9/11s a year for 26 years, just to give you a sense of that, the scale, right? So he became like a king when he did ultimately end the civil war. I mean, he became very strategic about it, pulled the Sri Lankan military and charged after the Tamil Tigers, as they were called. They were a rebel group, and decimated them. And there was a lot of war crimes that were created in the midst of all of that. How can you without that? So the international community, the human rights violations, they're all being witnessed and watched. However, within Sri Lanka, after 26 years of this brutal war, the Rajapaksas came to be treated like literally like gods. Some people were treating him exactly the way Trump is treated. Like there's a cult-like personality syndrome there, for sure. Which I see here, like the Trumpian phenomena is like a bit of a cult, actually. Same thing happened in Sri Lanka. So eventually it became nepotism at its best. Several of his brothers were in charge of many different ministries, as they're called in Sri Lanka. There are different departments. And they were heading about 70% of the economy of Sri Lanka. One of the Rajapaksas, or several Rajapaksas, were in charge of the economy, 70% of it. And eventually, this is where I see that sort of the redness, like the warrior energy that is very image conscious and wants instant gratification. That's where this leadership came from. They're very corrupt, very power hungry. If you got in their way, they would actually kill you. So they would have certain journalists killed, for example. They felt that Sri Lanka needed all these kinds of fancy infrastructure projects. They wanted to make Sri Lanka look like Singapore or Dubai. And so they started borrowing money, and China was ever ready to give the money. Here, take it, take it, take it. This is what China is doing to many developing countries. And so what these countries, these mainly poor countries, don't realize is their debt is ballooning, and they're taking all these loans. And then when crises happen, there's no plan. There's no plan B. So for Sri Lanka, there's all this mismanagement and corruption through the Rajapaksa regime through several decades now. So from 2008 all the way up until a couple days ago, the Rajapaksas were still the leaders of this country. So that's a long time. China, in my opinion, basically started pretty much sort of colonizing Sri Lanka from an economic perspective. This is the way China colonizes. It's not the way the old British and the Dutch and the Portuguese and the Spanish colonized countries. China is doing it economically, financially. And then, so there's the looming debt crisis. And then in 2019, really unexpectedly, Sri Lanka had an ISIS attack. And Sri Lanka is a very tiny Muslim population, so it caught everyone a little bit off guard that there would be an ISIS infiltration. Somehow they did infiltrate Sri Lanka, and they attacked 2 churches during Easter Sunday service. And they attacked the Christians, and they attacked tourists in several top hotels in Colombo. And that was one of the biggest ISIS attacks anywhere in the world that took close to 300 lives, killed close to 300 lives. So that's 2019. Tourism, which is absolutely compulsory, mandatory for Sri Lankan economy, went basically to zero after that ISIS attack. And just as tourism was starting to return by 2020, we go into COVID. So then that flattens everything in Sri Lanka as far as tourism is concerned. So you can imagine all developing nations absolutely rely, they must have US dollars. We have to have dollars. We can't do anything with, because local currencies mean nothing to the international market. So Sri Lanka just, the foreign reserves are shrinking, ballooning debt, shrinking foreign reserves. And then at the same time, tourism goes to zero. And then there's massive inflation in the country. And in the meantime, the Sri Lankan president, this is interesting from a developmental perspective also, the president, one of the Rajapaksas, Gotabaya, who you mentioned, suddenly decides that he's going to ban all chemical fertilizer in the country, in the island. There is a strong discussion going around in the anti-woke communities of the US and around the Western world that it's wokeism that created certain environmental policies that pushed the Sri Lankan government to sign up for this deal where they are going to become the world's first country that is going to ban chemical fertilizer. I think that it may have played a role, but I also think that some segments of the sort of the right-leaning media in Western countries are using that as means to attack woke green. I really don't think that that was what happened, although I think the president may have received some pressure, some incentive to sign up for some deal like that. And I think the problem is any 12-year-old would understand you can ban something, you can remove something from me, but you have to provide an alternative to it. You can't just ban fertilizer overnight and not provide organic fertilizer. He didn't do that. I mean, this is a grown man who didn't figure that out. So food security became a massive issue. All the fields and plantations in Sri Lanka basically dried out because the farmers couldn't farm anymore. That was a huge problem. And typically Sri Lanka was able to provide for itself with things like staples like rice. And Sri Lanka had to start importing rice and a lot of other food that we couldn't grow anymore. So this was a huge problem in Sri Lanka. And then eventually, I think it was really early 2022 that somebody decided to actually look at the bank account and the balance sheet and realized we have no dollars. So that's where things are at right now. And that's what caused, it was like a stunning shock because nobody really knew this was going to happen, or those who knew didn't care. They should have gone to the IMF sooner. They should have started, attacking this issue 2-3 years ago. And so that's where the protests began, and that's where we're at right now.
There seems to be so many potentially traumatic events in this story, right? They lived through civil war and tsunami and ISIS and COVID and the realization that your leaders haven't been looking after you. Do you feel like there's a sense of trauma in the population?
Certainly. I do think that There is, because now there is a lot of data that's actually coming out where many low to mid income folks are actually surviving on 1 or 2 meals a day. It's not the ease of like having just the basics of 3 meals a day doesn't exist. People are standing online for gas. So there's no gas. And by the way, in Sri Lanka, what we call gas here is referred to as petroleum gas, and what they call gas is what they use to cook. It's like this canister of gas people buy, and it's hooked up to your stove, and that's how people cook in Sri Lanka. So there's no fuel and there's no cooking gas, and there's just not enough medicine. Everything's gone. So the trauma can really be seen that some people have died of heat attacks because they're standing on line for hours carrying gas canisters, waiting in line for days. So some elderly folks have died. We've had many cases of that. Pregnant women haven't been able to get to hospitals on time because they couldn't find a taxi, or the car that she owned or the family owned didn't have gas. So that stuff is happening, and that's just scary. Children have not been able to go to school. Exams were banned because they didn't have enough paper to print exam papers for kids. So that stuff is bizarre. I know my friends who are building, like, they put like 3 bricks and sticks in the middle, and this very primitive way of cooking. That's what they're using these days to cook. So, however, so let me also say, so once this started, I'm sure you're aware of the protests. A lot of people have been seeing the protests online. The protests also created a cultural shift. I believe some of that may not change. The youth of the country, as in many other cultures, are in a different place from the old men who are mostly running the country and have been doing that for generations. The youth are far more tech savvy. They're through social media. They know how other people in parts of the world live, how they speak, how they communicate with each other, what kinds of new technologies are coming up. Sri Lankan young people are also quite savvy in that way. So they have a very different outlook. And the good thing that has come out of this disaster is that I think parts of the Sri Lankan culture have woken up. Woken up in a good way. I don't mean woke. But yeah, for example, during the protests, they've come up with many different demands for constitutional amendments. They're fighting for a change in how politicians rule or govern, that they're actually working for the people, which for generations, I think Sri Lankan politicians have forgotten, because people treat them like they're some kind of kings, or they're given a car and limitless numbers of trips abroad. And it's like all that has to stop. And the young people are really demanding that. Then there are some other interesting things, like for the first time in Sri Lanka, there was a Pride festival that happened in this very conservative country inside of the protest site. It's like Occupy Wall Street. There's a part of the city of Colombo that's been occupied. It's been largely very peaceful protesting, people singing and performing and that kind of thing, which even looked a little silly. It got violent for the first time only once, when the prime minister did a very Trumpian thing. He invited thousands of his supporters to the formal residence, the official residence of the prime minister, and he said, go attack the Occupy place. And that they went and they set fire to the tents of these protesters, and that created a lot of retaliation. And there were those government officials' houses were set on fire and such. But that was the only time it got really violent. And then the protesters had a huge protest on the 9th of July, and that was the culmination. They just decided, you can gas us, you can water cannon us, and we're just going to have thousands of people who are just going to fight past all the barricades. And they did. So there were some good things. Also, things that have been sort of unheard of, like during Hajj, the Muslim population who would come to the protest site when it was raining, the Sinhalese people would hold umbrellas for the Muslims to be able to say their prayers, which means they're sort of kneeling down and things like that. During Hajj, the Muslims provided food for some of the LGBTQ populations that were like little pockets in the protest site. So those things are really new changes for the culture. There's always good. I think that it's going to take several decades, perhaps even, to really come out of this brutal situation. It is dire. It is grave what's happening right now. I just refuse to blame anyone else, and I hope more Sri Lankans see that. And I do think many Sri Lankans see that this is self-inflicted. On a large scale, I think we still need to respect the fact that it is a complex culture, just because of some of those cultural dynamics, such as hundreds of years of colonization and what that does to a culture, to like the making of a culture. But a lot of the but at that kind of more surface level, it's also very self-inflicted. So I don't know, I think I'm kind of rambling a little bit here.
This sense of a country being run by like oligarchic clans, it's something I see all over the place. Like there's another Marcos becoming president in the Philippines now. So like this is very common, and we have a developmental story, and the simplified version of the developmental story is you keep making these moves. So the traditionalists are becoming modern, but there's this like shadow side to it where new things can cause regression in certain senses, right? A lot of the early theorists about electric technology said it would create a new medievalism. And like you were saying about China, there's a sense in which some large modern economies might be behaving in ways that sabotage countries like Sri Lanka and cause them to be more primitive than they might naturally be. I'm curious how you think about the effect of like higher structures potentially sabotaging development.
Well, yes, and I think that what you're saying is potentially what might have happened with the chemical fertilizer ban. That's it might have happened because green was dictating environmental policies in order, like, hey, we'll help you if you become chemical free. So that the country was absolutely not prepared for that. And so I can see what you're saying as an example. That could be one way in which that happens. I can also remember during the war, Norway was playing a big role in peace talks in Sri Lanka, trying to bring the Tamil Tigers and the Sri Lankan state for peace talks. And I remember how the Norwegians would sort of come into this traditional space where there was a lot of sort of magical warrior kind of thinking even, and offer mostly modern and postmodern solutions that really just doesn't make sense culturally in infrastructurally in many ways. And my guess is because poor countries are desperate for money and for economic assistance, they might just say yes to these higher values or higher codes of being that they don't really fully understand or can implement countrywide, and get into trouble after that. Those are just two examples that I can think of from a Sri Lankan context. I don't know if you have any other examples.
Well, I mean, there's one of the arguments about modernity is that it has these side effects where it actually sabotages a lot of the underlying conditions and causes regression. Right? And that's where, like, like a smart, healthy, green critique of modernism and capitalism would be saying it doesn't actually cause everybody to become healthy modernists. It actually undermines a lot of the developmental preconditions and things like that. So I think there's a lot of ways in which we can think of sort of many levels as having this regressive effect sometimes. But when you mentioned it, I got curious about how Sri Lankans view the other countries. Like I would say, particularly China and the US, and also maybe the Russia-Ukraine situation. What's your sense of how world affairs are being viewed and how other countries are being viewed by the Sri Lankans in your experience?
Yeah, I will say Sri Lankans, I definitely don't want to lump all of Sri Lanka into this pre-modern traditional, because there actually is a lot of modernity and even a lot of post-modernity has always been there, even before the 2 decades that I have been living in the West, in the US. They were always there, just sometimes just merely by being a primarily Buddhist country. There were many good, healthy, green ideas in Sri Lanka often. They are pretty well educated. For example, BBC has always played a big role in Sri Lankan media. So people were always exposed to BBC News, and people would watch BBC News often, including also CNN International. Those were the 2 of the big stations that were always available, even when I used to still live in Sri Lanka. So people were in touch, and many people are very educated about international affairs. America was all good for the US, I would say the US, until the Rajapaksas came into power. When the Rajapaksas were going, during the war or ending of the war, when the human rights, what is the human rights organization? I'm just drawing a blank right now. UNHCR? United Nations Human, whatever it's called now. Anyway, there's a lot of
United Nations Human Rights Organization.
Yeah, that's it. So yeah, so they, they're after the Rajapaksas, and a lot of them the criticism was coming from the US around human rights violations. So the Rajapaksas, some of them were even US citizens before they ran for election. Some of them had been living in the US and they had US citizenship. But they became very anti-US and became friendlier with Russia and China. So sometimes in certain sort of United Nations meetings and such, Russia would help or support Sri Lanka just because they would want to not support the US. And by doing that, they would encourage Sri Lanka to not sign up for certain environmental treaties and such. So Sri Lanka has been isolating itself to some degree and becoming a little bit anti-Western with that nationalism that the Rajapaksas are really sort of provoking and invoking in Sri Lanka. I think countries like New Zealand and Canada, those 2 corners of the world map, have always been very kind and generous. And Canada, especially after the war, took in a lot of refugees. So Canada actually has a pretty huge Sri Lankan population. Most of them came as Tamil refugees. There's a lot of them that used to send dollars to Sri Lanka. I think there's always this sort of the sweetness of Canada and countries like New Zealand that even Sri Lankans have less of a charge against countries like that because they don't beat down and bully. In some ways, countries like America actually bully little Sri Lanka. I mean, look at the human rights violations globally America has created, but they don't see that. They bully little countries like Sri Lanka. They don't see what they do in Iraq and Afghanistan, but they definitely see what tiny little Sri Lanka does as a war crime. So there's a part of me also that where I also get angry with that kind of hypocrisy, like the bullshit of big, powerful countries like America, the US. So they have become a little bit anti-Western, but now lately I have been seeing in Sri Lankan media where some people are saying we need to get back into like good books with the West, with America especially.
You
And
mentioned
by
that.
the way, I wanted to mention also with like that ISIS attack, COVID, all of that played a role in Sri Lanka's economy just dwindling to nothing, but also the Russia-Ukraine war. Russia and Ukraine were both the two number one and number two biggest tourists who came to Sri Lanka. So that came to a zero as well. And then also the Chinese zero COVID policies really impacted supply chain issues. So
How did Sri Lanka become such a primary tourist destination for Russians?
it's probably cheap.
Okay.
Yeah, it's probably cheap, and so I kind of hate to say this, even though there are very wealthy people in Russia, I think the general Russian tourist is not the same. They probably don't have the same amount of dollars to spend as a tourist as perhaps a European tourist might have, especially Western European tourists. So you would see a lot of Eastern Europeans and Russians coming to countries like Sri Lanka because it's a cheaper destination, I believe. Yeah.
I'm curious about media. And you mentioned the BBC, and at least the way you speak is very precise in a way. You said Indonesia, and most Americans say Indonesia.
Oh, yeah.
Like a more British English.
Yeah.
How do you find people relate to the media, whether it's the BBC or local media? Do you find they trust the media? Do you face their critique of the production of narratives? Do people watch something on the television or the social media and just believe it? Or is there a lot of skepticism about those things?
The skepticism is growing, and there are a few media sites within Sri Lanka that people are starting to trust more. So there's, for example, one station called News First Sri Lanka, and I think I'm noticing myself as I'm glued to the news these days. They're really becoming more trustworthy. They're just really transparent and lots of live streams of events that are going on. And Sri Lanka is very similar to the US in the sense that there has always been a media station that lines up with the regime, so to say. So there's a state-owned media company that'll just kind of blabber whatever the regime is talking about. The sort of the governing party will rule that media. So that's very dangerous, but that has always happened where there is one particular media, one or several media stations that are very partisan. It's very similar to what happens here in many ways. So that happens in Sri Lanka. And depending on what political agenda the everyday person has, you will watch the news accordingly. International news, I think Sri Lankans, obviously, I will also say those who watch BBC and CNN International are the English-speaking Sri Lankans. There are quite a lot of Sri Lankans who speak British English mostly, and many who can manage English. They can hear, they can understand that just because of our British colonization history, there's a fair bit of English in Sri Lanka, and people can generally manage. So they watch BBC, CNN International for international news, even though they may not fully understand the political actual dynamics of other countries. I will say something really funny, which really shocked me. In the early days of the protests in Sri Lanka, a couple of months ago, one of these state-owned media channels, one of their presenters or reporters came and criticized the protest site, this Occupy place, that the protest site that had been building momentum. he said it's like a beach party, and that, if you want free food, you can go there, and people are like dancing, and if you want like to listen to music and stuff, go there, because that's all it is. You don't need to take this seriously. And the protesters and large a hashtag went around on Twitter called what was it? Discount Tucker Carlson. So Tucker Carlson, the Fox guy here, somehow some Sri Lankans knew about Tucker Carlson enough to call that guy Discount Tucker Carlson, which just blew my mind. It's like, how on earth did these Sri Lankans know about Tucker Carlson and the fact that he's a mouthpiece for Fox and the right wing? So it's very surprising. So there's lots of interesting dynamics. Now, Sri Lanka has also done, the Rajapaksa regime has done things like banning WhatsApp and banning social media sites at certain times. And they were so heavily criticized, they somehow didn't do that during this whole protest time. People use social media a lot in Sri Lanka.
Before we started recording, you were speaking about what's emerging for you as an increased emphasis on the importance of leadership.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if there are any people you think would be much better leaders in Sri Lanka. Are there people or movements or proposed social changes or anything that you feel would be legitimately higher and deeper and more ethical and also capable of working with the existing conditions? What do you see that stands out to you as favorable?
Yes, absolutely. I think that even my own problem has been that for several years, I myself wasn't following the Sri Lankan news as closely. So there are some people who I think are probably good leaders, but they will never actually step into that role. For example, in my opinion, there's a woman called Otara who just came out of nowhere and built this amazing, very ethical business in Sri Lanka. And she runs a bunch of nonprofit organizations, but she built also a for-profit business empire. Those are actually the kinds of leaders who will probably really bring change to Sri Lanka, but they'll never actually come into this world of politics. Within the world of politics, there are some, these names won't make much sense in this context, I think, of our conversation, but there are a few folks that including Sajid Premadasa, who gave his name currently to today's the big day in Sri Lanka. This is middle of the night for them, but the 20th of July is when the parliament will elect a new president, given that our former president is no longer the president. So there were 4 people who had submitted their names to run for this office, and one of them pulled their application back. His name is Sajid Premadasa. He is one who went to he got his higher education at the London School of Economics, and he was doing his graduate studies in the University of Minnesota, I believe, here in the US. And he also did some work like interning or something like that for John Kerry and John McCain. He had met some of those people in his day, back in the day when he was a student in the US. I had some hope for him. But apparently he's not very popular in Sri Lanka. I don't know why. So I think even Ranil Wickremesinghe, the current acting president, he's actually not that horrible. It's just that in the last several years, he just hung out in this world of politics for too long, 50 years in politics. And eventually in the last decade or so, he also got caught in some corrupt activity. So now he's hated, which is sad because actually he used to be a good guy that I would have thought would actually have made a good president, but not anymore. So they're scraping the barrel, in all honesty. I think Sri Lanka is scraping the barrel to find good political leadership, given the gravity of the situation. Who wants to step
Yeah.
into that role. So it's a tough, very tough situation.
What
There has always been what's called the brain drain.
hmm. What would
Do
you
you
describe as the characteristics, of a leader who would be good for Sri Lanka, whether they would be willing to or not?
very good, healthy, traditional, heavy on discipline, heavy on there's always that's the problem, right? The danger of traditionalism is very powerful as well. But if we can find like a benevolent dictator, if you've heard that metaphor, I think for countries in developing nations, developing nations often lack things like sticking to the rule and following law and order. There's just a lot of like red that needs to be disciplined. So I see we need a good benevolent dictator type amber blue traditional leader. However, we could really use a good business mind from a more modern perspective as well. Someone who can actually balance the accounts, and someone who actually develops very friendly relations with the Western world again. So just more of the sort of the scientific rational approach to governance. I don't care that much that Sri Lanka goes beyond that at this moment. I think we need that type of a leader.
I'm curious what sense you have of the wisdom history of Sri Lanka. You mentioned the Theravadan Buddhist tradition. I'm sure there were some esoteric elements of the Tamil culture as well. What's your sense of the like the ancient developmental culture of the region?
There are pockets of Sri Lanka that will understand and engage in spirituality in the way that most likely you and I can probably engage in a spiritual conversation. But I will say those are only very small pockets, given again the sort of a general this is probably very crude and even rude for me to do that, but I'm doing it because I'm Sri Lankan, so I have the right to do it. Like I've already done, is just kind of lumping in general Sri Lanka into that sort of pre-modern traditional zone. So the spiritual discussion, the religious background, that's where that is mostly situated at. It's a much more simpler conversation. Again, that does not mean I don't agree with the criticism of Theravadan Buddhism that a lot of like very green Buddhists in the US, my Naropa community would call Theravadan Buddhists Hinayana. Hinayana literally means stupid. The word Hina actually means stupid. So I think many Westerners here seem to think that it is small, like the small vehicle and the great vehicle, which is Mahayana Buddhism. So the Sri Lankan Buddhist practice just tends to be a little bit more even childlike in my opinion sometimes. However, at the same time, there is a lot of intellectual depth as well. A lot of Sri Lankans have studied intellectually. They may not sit and meditate and do the practice often, but they get it at least at an intellectual level. And I would say it's a very practical, there's a lot of practical applications of these ancient spiritual teachings in Sri Lanka. Yeah. And again, it's mostly Buddhist. I will be honest in saying that there is absolutely all four major religions: Christianity, Islam, and the Hinduism. But 71% of the population is falling under the sort of the Sinhalese Buddhist region. So that's where much of the historical representation of religion and spirituality really comes from that.
What about nature? When you're there, do you go for walks? Do you camp? Do you go to the beach? What's amazing about the landscape? What are your power spots in Sri Lanka? What do you love about the geology and the biology?
Yeah. It is a beautiful island. This is what is so heartbreaking for me. And actually, in the years leading up to the ISIS attack, Sri Lanka was consistently named one of the top destinations by Lonely Planet and a lot of the top travel sites, TripAdvisor, and Sri Lanka was doing really well. I myself went to Sri Lanka with 9 of my friends from here, from the US in 2018. So just a mere couple of months before the ISIS attack. We went to some of the best historical sites. So there are lots of ancient sites that you would want to visit if you went to Sri Lanka, where the ancient remains of Buddhist temples are. They're thousands of years old. The history that you can study is incredible. If you love the ocean, this is it's a tiny island, but if you love the ocean, it's a big place that you can enjoy, surfing, whale watching. Sri Lanka has one of the biggest blue whale colonies in the world. As tiny as the island is, you can go from the coast to where the tea, if you've heard of Ceylon tea, for example, tea is one of the biggest export products. The tea plantations, as they're called, are beautiful places. That it's in one of those places that I first encountered the Ken Wilber book. In fact, there was a meditation retreat center in the middle of a tea plantation, which is where I first encountered Integral. And the rest is history after that, right? So lots of rainforests that are highly protected zones. Elephants are native to our country, and so that's a problem as well. There's a lot of deforestation that has dwindled our elephant population. But we didn't do much camping and such. There's a little bit more of that now, which is really odd because I think Sri Lankans are doing more things like that because of Instagram. They want to just post pictures on Instagram. So it's weird how that has happened, but it's just too hot. We're like just a couple degrees south of the equator. So it's a very warm country. Outdoor activities, there's lots of it, but it's also really hot and uncomfortable in many ways. But it's really mostly a beach culture. People love to listen to reggae music. They'll like Bob Marley is like Sri Lanka's favorite. And people love to, like, after work, they love to go to bars and drink. And there are lots of bars along the coast. And during the weekends, even Sri Lankan families love to get out of the city and go to a coastal town and get into a little holiday mode. Lots of Buddhist holidays. The month of May celebrates the biggest holiday because that's the month. The full moon day of each month is a day to commemorate something special that happened in the life of the Buddha. So in the month of May, huge celebrations because the full moon day of the month of May is when we commemorate the birth of the Prince Siddhartha, his enlightenment as the Buddha, and then his parinibbana, which is his passing. So, yeah, I mean, Sri Lanka is an amazingly diverse geography in that sense of high country. There's the mountainous region, and then there's the beach and the in between. Yeah. So I have a question for you, Layman.
Please.
Yeah. What had you, because it's such an obscure topic for you to feel, for you to enter into dialogue with anyone like Sri Lanka? Why on earth? Why Sri Lanka? And also, what had you feeling like you want to have this conversation around international affairs as a part of the integral stage?
I think advanced discussion communities run into the same sorts of questions at their edges a lot, right? There's a lot of, oh, where are the women, or where are the Black people, or are we too focused on Western Europe and North America, or these sorts of questions. And they're valid and people talk about them, but nothing really comes of these discussions. So because we have this tool, because we have the integral stage, it seemed to me important to take advantage of the opportunity. And there's a flavor to touching the places of the world that I think is important for people who are ostensibly working on planetary and world-centric consciousness and culture. How can you do that if you don't have a more visceral sense of what the world consists of? Mm-hmm. And also, so for myself, there's such a sense that I'm not being nourished by the information I hear about the world through media. Mm-hmm. And so the way that I can get a sense of what's going on in the world is through people who I trust and respect, who have a sense of the richness of parts of the world. So partly it's for me to participating in the planet, but I think it's the fulfillment of a promise that higher discussion communities should be more multicultural, international, and richer and more multi-flavored. So this is one of the great ones to start, because I know you a little bit, and so this seemed like an awesome place to start. Bruce has connections with Nepal, so we're going to do Nepal. But there's a lot of people who talk to us about Ukraine. I don't know where it goes beyond that, but it just seemed like you were an obvious person to start with, and therefore it's partly about Sri Lanka, and it's partly about the world, and it's partly about you.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, well, lots of green points for you. He's a woman of color, a woman from a different country. Lots of green points by the integral stage. Yay. But no, that's good to hear. It's true. I think you're definitely not going to get, if this goes on YouTube, this is not going to be one of your most viewed videos with a Sri Lankan topic. But I really admire you for just sort of stepping into that world, like I said, such an obscure topic.
Well, I think people it's not in the top of their mind. They're not thinking, oh, I want to learn more about Sri Lanka, but I think there is a hunger for the interpersonal and more intelligent richness of the world community that people, if they check with themselves, they probably are interested.
Oh, cool. Yeah, well, I sure hope so. Yeah.
I was going to ask you a question that's sort of, I don't know, metaphysical or something like that. Like, what can you do in yourself to heal Sri Lanka? Like, you're a holographic representative of it, or what's the next step for you in having a deeper, richer, more healing relationship to Sri Lanka?
Yeah, I really appreciate that question. Yeah, I'm actually really moved by that, because it brings up a lot for me. Just the fact that I gave up Sri Lanka in some ways when I left Sri Lanka. And a lot of Sri Lankans, just like a lot of people from India or Pakistan or many developing nations, we abandon our cultures and our countries when we need higher education for the most part. That's what leads us out of our cultures and our communities. So I abandoned Sri Lanka for my own development, for my own evolution, for my own gain. And I wonder if more, and that's, I'm not saying at all that I'm a highly evolved person and that I'm a very brainy person. I'm not saying that at all. But there is a brain drain there in these countries where people who can perhaps, at least on a good day, take bigger perspectives are not there in the country. And when a crisis happens, they leave, they are the ones who try to get out the first. So right now, there's even a bigger drain going on right now. People who have money, they will leave. They're leaving already. When John Vervaeke talks about grieving the death of God, I think that I've been healing myself a little bit in some ways by really grieving my own loss of and abandonment of my own culture to some degree. And there is a certain sense of guilt wrapped around it somehow. And I think that's sometimes a reason why I'm watching the Sri Lankan news so closely these days. And I watch and I cry a lot. Like I notice that I'm like suddenly just, I have tears in my eyes, and sometimes just, I live alone here and I'm just like openly sometimes just sobbing and just so sad for a country that was sort of the envy of South Asia, in the way this collapse is huge, and it is symbolic of 107 other nations that the United Nations has identified as potentially going in the same direction as Sri Lanka. Egypt, Lebanon, Tunisia, Turkey, Nepal, even South Africa, Argentina, Peru, El Salvador. A lot of these countries are heading in the direction of Sri Lanka. So this global debt crisis is a humongous, at a certain level, a spiritual crisis. It is in many ways related to the meaning crisis, the crisis of culture wars and the crisis of hyper objects. They're all really like happening. For me personally, it's really just been allowing myself to not even necessarily heal, but really just simply allow myself to feel all the complexity that I have as someone who was Sri Lankan. I gave up my Sri Lankan citizenship in 2016 to become a US citizen. But at the same time, I'm very Sri Lankan still in so many ways, because I'm not someone who moved to the US as a child. I moved here as a fully grown adult woman. So I'm very Sri Lankan. When I watch the protest sites and in Sri Lankan news, I know those places in my city. Places I used to drive through. I remember places. So it's very alive for me, and I am hurting for my country. And I think that there is, even at the Emerge conference where we were at, I had a brief conversation with Tristan Harris on the first day. And when I told him I'm from Sri Lanka, I'm not sure how it came up, but it came up, and he asked me about the Sri Lankan situation. And I remember just feeling so touched by him asking, for the reasons why I told you at the beginning of this call, around why I appreciate you wanting to speak to me about this. Nobody does. So I have a sort of a personal little heartbreak constantly. And I give space for that heartbreak. And in a way, in the way Vervaeke talks about grieving the loss of God, I grieve my own loss of my culture, my community, for myself, and the ways in which it is being destroyed right now for millions of Sri Lankans in my country. Yeah. So thank you for asking that question.
That's a very vulnerable and tragic and beautiful and poignant place in the conversation. I don't think we're going to do better than that. But before we go, I guess I want to ask if there's anything else. Like, is there anything important or interesting or juicy about Sri Lanka that I haven't asked you about that you'd like to add into the conversation?
One day, I'm really hoping for this, that one day that some of us folks from this little meta-modern integral world will have a beautiful event in Sri Lanka. That is my dream, and I am going to make that happen someday. And you will be coming to Sri Lanka, I believe, at some point.
Emerge Colombo 2030.
Yay! Yes. So I'll ask you. Let this be the final question, and then we can close, perhaps. What have you learned today from our conversation?
What is most meaningful to me in a way is a sense of the landscape. Right? I think the sense of the beaches and the elephants, and even of the people getting drunk and eating chicken on the beaches. That sense of what's really going on there for people who are trying to live their lives.
Mm-hmm.
So that enters my heart, and it tells me something that I'm not going to find out by watching the news.
Yes, absolutely. Good. Well, thank you, Layman.
This was fabulous. Thank you very much, Namali. I appreciate this.
Thank you. Thanks for engaging. And yeah, more power to you in all of your conversations, and especially these international conversations that you are seeking to have. And thank you.